And in many ways, I think
That,
that's
if I can just, because that's a useful segue into reminding people about the eBay auction, which is one of the ways we're raising money. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, Richard, but three of your books, The Selfish Gene, and two others which I made a note of. I apologise, I can't remember offhand what they are actually on the eBay auction, and they have been bought by someone who will be meeting Richard in the United States in October, and within
Oh, good.
reason and decorum, they're going to be have a personalised message from Richard with his signature on them. The Selfish Gene at the moment is going for over $400, but the other ones that were less than that the last time I looked. And also, maybe a useful segue into telling us about your latest book that you're working on, Richard.
I was persuaded by my British and American publishers that I ought to do an autobiography. That's what I'm now working on. You hear my slightly embarrassed laugh. I'm a little bit self-conscious about doing this. Actually, it's going surprisingly well. I'm through childhood, and I've reached the age of about 34, and I'm steadily growing up. Childhood was assisted by the fact that my mother remembers a lot of detail, and I go and talk to her a lot about my childhood and getting funny stories from her, which I put in the book. In adulthood, I've reached the stage where I'm talking mostly about science, and I hope that's all right. I mean, I'd welcome your opinion, actually. I'm now quite largely talking about my scientific work in my 30s and 40s. And I hope I can make it interesting. It's obviously a lot less personal than the childhood part of the book, which is, I suppose, entirely personal. The justification for putting childhood in, of course, is that it's supposed to, explain how I came to be what I was as an adult. But
do you think that that has explained it, having gone through the process of writing about your childhood? Do you?
Sure. I'm not sure. I mean, I think that anybody's childhood can be sort of quite interesting in a way. I mean, I had a very, I suppose you might say, privileged childhood. I mean, I was sent to boarding schools, rather expensive boarding schools in England. I had a very good education. Along with that went a lot of cruelty, a lot of bullying. These schools are not as bad as they were, but and they weren't as bad in my time as they were in an earlier time. But nevertheless, being sent away to boarding school at the age of 7 is quite a traumatic experience, and that I think probably comes through. I think I was something of a late developer as a scientist, that I didn't really develop a major enthusiasm for science, which I now have enormously. Didn't really develop that until I was at Oxford at the age of about 19. So that in a way is a bit late, but that's the truth anyway.
Do you think that when the book is published, your critics, the theists, will go through it with a tooth comb, particularly your childhood, trying to identify why it is that you hate God so much?
No. I mean, the truth of the matter is that I just care about truth. I mean, I care passionately about what's true. And so obviously, therefore, I regard the question of whether there is anything supernatural, any sort of gods, any sort of magic spells. It's a very important question, because if it's true, then the world in which we live is a very different kind of world from the one in which I think we live, the scientific world. So if you care about the truth, then I think you're pretty well bound to care about religious questions. You can't just regard them as boring and uninteresting and peripheral. But they're totally barking up the wrong tree if they're looking for, I was abused by a priest or something like that. Nothing of the kind. There's nothing like that. I was given a very rather liberal religious upbringing. I went to my schools were Anglican Church of England schools. The Church of England, it's a very weakened strain of the virus. I mean, it doesn't, they don't indoctrinate like Muslims or Roman Catholics. And so I can't really complain of that.
I mean, one of sorry, Sandra, if I could make very quickly, one of the people you interviewed, I think, in the series The Root of All Evil was someone who I have to say is my favourite bishop, the former Bishop of Oxford, Richard Harries, who is so liberal that you actually, when you were talking with him, you asked him whether there was any point in him having this faith at all. And I think, sorry, do go on. Did you recall his answer? I think it was, well, there were certain things that he did think were necessary.
Right. For him, the one sort of irreducible thing, the one thing that he couldn't give up was the resurrection. And he wasn't really bothered about any of the rest, about virgin birth and things like that. I've actually been quite surprised, and I'd be interested to know your experience of this. I thought that sophisticated theologians were supposed to say, oh, it's all metaphorical. And I've been accused of going after easy targets, people like Ted Haggard, sort of fundamentalist loonies. And people have said, why don't you go after sophisticated theologians? So I've started talking to sophisticated theologians, and I've been pretty amazed, actually, by how literalistic.
Disappointing?
Well, I mean, the Archbishop of Canterbury believes in miracles. Another sophisticated theologian that I spoke to believes that Jesus turned water into wine. These people aren't supposed to do that. They're supposed to say, well, that's all metaphorical. But no, they seem to, I mean, the line they seem to take is, well, I believe in the resurrection. That's the one thing I won't give up. And if Jesus is capable of the resurrection, he might as well do everything else as well, I think is their attitude.
Thunder, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I just wanted to briefly make a point about Church of England, as far as I can see, is more of a country club where religion is just the colour of the wallpaper. I mean, it really is like that it's a social club more than religion. Most of the people who go to the churches, they just like getting together and singing. You ask a lot of these people, do they actually believe any of it? And it's like, well, not really, but, you know, I like getting together and singing. Sorry.
Yeah, I think that's largely right. And that's one possible explanation for why those countries in Western Europe that have an established church, like England and like the Scandinavian countries, they are the least religious countries in the world. And it could be because it's become part of the wallpaper, as you say. It's become sort of boring. Whereas in America, where there is no established church, and constitutionally, the very idea of an established church is anathema. And America is founded on secularism. That laid the way open to religion as free enterprise to become exciting and charismatic, and to fragment into a whole lot of churches competing with each other for congregations, for lucrative tithes. And so you get a very different atmosphere about religion in America. It's not boring, it's just wrong.
Can I go back to the question you asked about our experiences of or encounters or conversations with distinguished theologians? I have to say that I found them as disappointing as any other theologian or believer. You're right, a lot of them do refer to things being allegorical or metaphorical and the like, but when pressed, they are unable to explain which bits are and by what metric they test whether it is allegorical or metaphoric. Much like objective morality, they say that objective morals believe, if you ask that it exists, but if you ask them how you test whether a moral is objective or not, they fail miserably in coming out with it. So coming up with any proper definition. So it's like, where are the proper theologians?
They just pick and choose, and if you actually look at what they pick and choose, it tends to be whatever is consonant with the current zeitgeist, whatever it is. I mean, in the early 21st century, we have certain moral values which are very much labeling of the 21st century. I mean, things like the equality of women, no slavery, no racism, preferably no isms of any kind. I mean, no ageism. That's very different from what it was 100 years ago, 50 years ago, let alone 200 years ago. And so the morals that we have, the values that we have, label us as members of the decade in which we live. Whether or not we are religious, whether we're religious or not, is pretty irrelevant. And so when these people look to their scriptures for the bits that they want to admit as taken literally, and the bits they just say are allegorical, it tends to be whatever fits in with the with the moral zeitgeist of their time. And if they're 21st century people, they will pick out the bits that say treat the sexes equally, whereas if they were 19th century, they wouldn't. Whatever it is, they don't get their decision from Scripture. Scripture is a kind of afterthought. They just choose which bits of Scripture to include.
Yes, and the most obvious example is looking at the list of things that you're forbidden to do in Leviticus. Next to "Thou shalt not lie with another man" is "Don't eat shellfish." One of which seems still to be relevant to these people today, but the other one not so. Thunder.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that always bugs me about this sort of criticism about you only pick on the weak targets is that it's the constantly moving goalpost. It's a universal criticism you can level no matter who you're actually going up against. And what I've usually found is that, all right, yes, you made that sort of superstitious belief look like nonsense in that one, but what about all of the others? And my reckoning is that the prime thing that discriminates the sophisticated and the unsophisticated theologians for the large part is how good a salesman they are. And I won't name names, but a lot of the sophisticated theologians really do come across as very good used car salesmen. It's a lousy product, but they're very good at selling it.
That's true, but when you look at their sales technique, I'm astonished anybody falls for it. I mean, they're just such smooth operators. I would run a mile if any of them tried to sell me a used car. They just look so insincere. They're obvious charlatans, but yet it seems to work.
There seems also to be an unhealthy attraction now for child preachers. Have you noticed that?
That's horrifying, and the abuse of children by religious people one tends to emphasize sexual abuse, but there's all sorts of other abuse going on. These horrific camps that they run, where they teach children to be soldiers for Jesus and to hate all other religions, and almost like military drill. And then you get these child preachers, these ridiculous little children, mouthing the absurd platitudes that they've been taught from the cradle upwards. It is horrifying.
Again, going back to, I think it was again the root of all evil. You interviewed a lady whose name is on the tip of my tongue. She was brought up with the Plymouth Brethren, now works as a psychologist helping people come out of religion. Do you recall the interview?
I do. She's a very, very nice woman, and I too have forgotten her name. It's Jill something.
It begins with an M. Mitten.
Yes.
Mitten or something like that. But I'm sorry?
I think her name is Jill Mitten. I think you're right.
Yes. What I like to do, so those that tell me that religious indoctrination cannot be considered as a form of child abuse, I played that interview to them. Do you want to, perhaps your recollection of basically her background and story will be better than mine?
This woman, she herself had been brought up, I forget what the cult was. I think it might have been Plymouth. No, it wasn't Plymouth Brethren.
I think it was Plymouth Brethren. We'll check. But
Brethren, I think. And she had real horror stories about her own upbringing and the people that, having finally broken free herself, she was then starting an organization to help other people escape from the same organization and from other such cults. I found especially moving was her expression of what it was like to fear hell. And they were told in no uncertain terms that they really were going to burn for all eternity if they, not just if they sinned, but if they ever left the brethren, and if they ever did anything to contradict the elders. It's an astonishing power that these people have to manipulate people, especially children, by these truly dreadful threats. There's a kind of law, I think, just like digression here, but there's a law that says that the more implausible a threat is, the more horrible it has to be in order to carry weight, both to, explain how I came to be what I was as an adult. But
do you think that has explained it, having gone through the process of writing about your childhood?
I'm not sure. I mean, I think that anybody's childhood can be sort of quite interesting in a way. I mean, I had a very, I suppose you might say, privileged childhood. I mean, I was sent to boarding schools, rather expensive boarding schools in England. I had a very good education.
And in many ways, I think
if I can just, because that's a useful segue into reminding people about the eBay auction, which is one of the ways we're raising money. I'm not sure whether you're aware of this, Richard, but 3 of your books, The Selfish Gene, and 2 others, which I made a note of, I apologise, I can't remember offhand what they are actually on the eBay auction, and they have been bought by someone who will be meeting Richard in the United States in October, and within reason and decorum, they're going to be have a personalised message from Richard with his signature on them. The Selfish Gene at the moment is going for over $400, but the other ones were less than that the last time I looked. And also, maybe a useful segue into telling us about your latest book that you're working on, Richard.
I was persuaded by my British and American publishers that I ought to do an autobiography. That's what I'm now working on. You hear my slightly embarrassed laugh. I'm a little bit self-conscious about doing this. Actually, it's going surprisingly well. I'm through childhood, and I've reached the age of about 34, and I'm steadily growing up. Childhood was assisted by the fact that my mother remembers a lot of detail, and I go and talk to her a lot about my childhood and getting funny stories from her, which I put in the book. In adulthood, I've reached the stage where I'm talking mostly about science, and I hope that's all right. I mean, I'd welcome your opinion, actually. I'm now quite largely talking about my scientific work in my 30s and 40s. And I hope I can make it interesting. It's obviously a lot less personal than the childhood part of the book, which is, I suppose, entirely personal. The justification for putting childhood in, of course, is that it's